Is this the most important week in South African politics in our lifetimes? With coalition talks running against the clock, the election of the president in parliament looming, and the potential for a new, fresh government, unlike we have ever seen before, we're about to dive into all those dynamics on SMWX. Let's go. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX fam. If you're new around here, my name is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. I think it's fair to say we're like the #1 current affairs YouTube destination for this kind of thing. The numbers don't lie. Thank you so much for all your support over the last few weeks, months, and years as we build this channel into an important, influential platform. Today I want to get into three things as the coalition landscape unfolds before our eyes, and I want to help you understand those dynamics. The first thing I want to do is talk about this proposal of a government of national unity and really help you get your head around what it means. Is what's being proposed a government of national unity? Is it a coalition? And more. So that's going to be the first part. After that, we're going to get into the coalition dynamics as they stand. I think we're heading in a particular direction. I'm again going to go through the threats and opportunities of that unfolding direction. And then finally, I want to talk about the first sitting of Parliament, which will be happening anytime towards the end of this week or the beginning of next week. It hasn't been announced at the time of recording, but I want to take you through some of the questions that pervade that sitting. There are legal questions, there are political questions, and I want to get into that in more depth as well. So sit back, relax. We have another extended episode of analysis for you on SMWX. Let's get into this first question about the government of national unity. Okay, so first gripe. What is being proposed is not a government of national unity, and I wish people would stop calling it a government of national unity because I very much doubt that's actually where we're heading. I'm going to back that up by showing you exactly what a government of national unity actually is, how it worked in South Africa before, how it has worked in other examples, particularly in Africa, where it's a common form of power sharing. We, in fact, lead the world in this unique device for creating political consensus. And then also just showing you how this that's being proposed in South Africa is not a government of national unity. It's being called a government of national unity for political reasons, largely to create a feeling of nostalgia for 1994 and to give the ANC political cover for going into a coalition, multi-party as it may be, with the DA. What is a government of national unity? Because this term has been bandied about. It's been used by all and sundry in very, very unhelpful and inaccurate ways. A government of national unity is not just a coalition. It's a particular and special kind of coalition that, surprise, surprise, includes national unity. Now, what does that mean? It's a particular kind of coalition that, unlike other coalitions which just seem to create or try to create a governing coalition, where you get over 50% of the seats in parliament and you're able to govern, a government of national unity tries to secure the widest possible representation of two things: the biggest parties in an election and the widest possible representation of the electorate itself. So what does that mean? It means that a government of national unity will usually include at least all the parties that are above 10% of the vote. It will usually represent up to 90% of the electorate, maybe sometimes 85%, but that's how much representation there is in a government of national unity. And the reason for that is a government of national unity is usually instituted at a time of crisis or transition or both. So it's instituted to try and make sure that the government is as legitimate as possible, has as much public support as possible, and therefore cannot be questioned on political grounds, and also reduces the likelihood of massive opposition to that government because the opposition is actually subsumed within the government. So that's what a government of national unity is. Usually at times of crisis or transition, most, if not all, the big political parties and at least somewhere around 90% of the electorate represented. And that's exactly what we saw in South Africa. So just to try and understand the historical picture in more clarity, the South African Government of National Unity in 1994, as we transitioned out of apartheid, was the first government we ever had. Funnily enough, most people think it lasted until the end of that term. It only lasted 2 years. It fell apart because the National Party pulled out of the Government of National Unity, citing their own political concerns. I want to have a deep look into the 94 Government of National Unity because it's important to actually contrast that government against what is being proposed here. And you'll see that there are dramatic differences, so that what is being proposed right now, I don't think can even be called a Government of National Unity. So let's take a look first at the cabinet, which is the creation of the Government of National Unity, right? You have the ANC, which has just got, I think it was somewhere around between 62 and 65% of the vote. The National Party has about 20% of the vote, and the IFP has about 10% of the vote. So together, they're getting close to like 90+% of the vote, right? And these three biggest parties came together. It was actually constitutionally mandated that any party above 10%, which included IFP, the National Party, and the ANC, would have to form part of this Government of National Unity. So we had the three biggest parties represented. No matter their differences, no matter how divergent they were, and believe me, I mean, you had the party of apartheid on one hand and the ANC on the other. They came together, and that's what created the unity. Now, in the current situation, it doesn't look to me like that's going to happen, in that at least two of the biggest parties seem to be being isolated from the Government of National Unity. In another scenario, which I think is less likely, then the DA wouldn't be part of a Government of National Unity. So I think EFF and MK, it looks to me, are not forming part of this Government of National Unity right now. And the DA is, which means that of the four biggest parties, okay, the EFF didn't quite get 10, but they got 9.6%, so let's round it off to 10. Two of them wouldn't be in the government. So that's not a Government of National Unity. That's a multi-party coalition, maybe, but we need to call things by their actual names. A Government of National Unity would include all the big parties, so it would say ANC, MK, EFF, DA, all of you come together, and that would be a Government of National Unity. Just because you have a lot of political parties that are small parties, which just seems to be what's being proposed here. So get all the 1% parties to the table, plus ANC and DA and IFP, that doesn't make it a Government of National Unity. It just makes it a very big multi-party coalition. So that's one difference with the Mandela cabinet and the current proposal, which seems to either exclude the DA or MK and EFF in the more likely scenario. In a Government of National Unity as well, power is shared proportionately to vote share. So remember I said the ANC got between 62 and 65, I can't remember the exact figure, 94, NP got 20, IFP got 10. They shared cabinet roughly proportionately to that. So, okay, it doesn't add up to 100%, those of you who are hawk-eyed arithmeticians. But what they did is they said, okay, it added up to about 90% if you added all those three parties together, the ANC, NP, and IFP. And if you then expanded that to 100, and you took the proportional representation of that, that's how many cabinet seats each party got. So in a nutshell, the ANC got the same number of cabinet seats, or the same percentage of the cabinet, as it had the percentage of the vote, right? So my question would be, would the ANC be happy with that? If we had a true Government of National Unity, which had all the biggest parties, and let's say we were representing 85, 90% of the electorate, then the ANC would only get between 40 and 50% of cabinet. Would ANC be happy with that? Because that's what a Government of National Unity is. You see, here's another difference. In 94, the ANC had a commanding majority. So it still was able to command the majority of cabinet because it had the majority of the vote. But if we were to have a true Government of National Unity now, the ANC would have at best half of cabinet, and at worst 40% of cabinet, which is the percentage of the vote that it got. So it actually wouldn't be able to dominate cabinet in the same way as Mandela's government did. And that's why that government of national unity worked quite well for the ANC. But if they were going to be fair about it, they would actually have a minority of cabinet, which I don't think they want to do. So what I think they want to do is inflate their size through a multi-party coalition and call it a government of national unity. So they want to take the credit and they want to use the cachet built up over the 94 government of national unity, but they want to have the power and they want to have the control of what is not a government of national unity, what is a coalition. And they want both at the same time. They want their cake and to eat it. And I think it's very important that we don't fall into the trap of calling things what political parties think they should be called, right? Just because the DA calls something a doomsday coalition doesn't mean it's a doomsday coalition. And I worry that the media has sometimes fallen victim to taking on the language of political actors with particular agendas. Similarly, just because the ANC calls something a government of national unity, because that's politically expedient for them to do, doesn't mean it is a government of national unity. And I've lost count of the number of news reports and broadcasts that are using this term without realizing that it's actually inapplicable given where we're headed. So that's another difference. However, even when the ANC had 60% or 66% of the cabinet, it was 66 to be exact, they still gave up massive positions in that government of national unity of 94. They gave up the Minister of Finance. I think they gave up mining, mineral resources. They gave up agriculture. Imagine, you're talking about land reform and then you give the agriculture ministry to a national party politician. There was also a land reform ministry, but the two go hand in hand. They were actually merged soon after the NP pulled out of the GNU. There were other positions. So the ANC also gave up a lot, even when they had 60 plus, 62 plus 65% of the vote, which would mean that in a true government of national unity, the ANC would have to be, and by the way, there were two deputy presidents, executive deputy presidents, one of which didn't come from the ANC either. So in a true government of national unity, the ANC would probably keep the presidency. They'd have a minority of cabinet, or half of it, and they would give up major portfolios like the finance ministry, mineral resources, maybe today public enterprises, and the like. So if the ANC truly wants a government of national unity, then they must embrace what it means to give up enough power to make it a true government of national unity. Otherwise, they're just throwing terms around and relying on people's ignorance of history. So basically, I have a problem with the attempt to dress up what is likely to be a multi-party coalition as a government of national unity, because the two things need to be separated. The power that different parties get under them is very different. And if a government of national unity is truly what the ANC wants, then they have to accept that they're going to have to lose more power than they could ever imagine and that anyone could have imagined, even if they're in control, ultimately, of the GNU. I just thought there were some interesting international examples that can flesh this out as well. So I mentioned that Africa and the African democratic tradition has been a leader around the world in this government of national unity setup. So after electoral violence in Kenya in 2007, there was a government of national unity, and that government of national unity was able to restore some semblance of stability, usher in a transitional and new constitution, which Kenya has then used in subsequent elections and navigated its way, although those elections have been highly contested. And the most recent one, of course, went to the Supreme Court. That government of national unity, again, was an example of how the two sides of the political coin came together. One, Mwai Kibaki being president, and the other side being vice president. So we could see clearly that, which was Raila Odinga at the time, clearly the two biggest parties came together, the two biggest players who represented the vast majority of the electorate came together in unity. They didn't leave any of the big players out. Similarly, in Zimbabwe, following the disputed 2008 election, which ZANU-PF lost outright, you had a government of national unity and a new constitution where you had both ZANU-PF and you had MDC under Morgan Tsvangirai at the time. Again, bringing together the two biggest parties in a way that made sure that the entire electorate virtually was represented. And there was another MDC faction as well that was part of the government. So again, a government of national unity, I'm not just talking about the South African example. When we look at other examples, it fits my definition, right? We saw a government of national unity, interestingly, in Italy recently under the COVID crisis, where Mario Draghi formed a government of national unity. You'll remember Italy was absolutely slammed by COVID. It was in a crisis. And what happened was that a kind of compromise candidate and everyone across the political spectrum, from the far right to the far left and everything in between, came together to form this government of national unity. It broke apart in 1 or 2 years, I think, but it was ultimately a response to a crisis, right? We could think of sometimes of wartime cabinets as kinds of governments of national unity as well, right? So that's what it is. And without belaboring the point, it's important that we know what it is so that we also know what it isn't and why people are trying to sell what is a government of national unity as a government of national unity when it actually isn't one. Thanks for watching SMWX. Before we get back to the episode, I just wanted to let you know the 4 ways that you can help support this channel if you want to see us growing bigger and better to keep you more entertained and informed. The first way is you can invite me to speak at your company, your school, your institution. You'll see the contact details down below. The second way is that you can become a member of this channel. Become a member, or you can give us a thanks. You'll see there's like a heart with a $sign in the ribbon below this video. Buy me and the team some coffee for this episode. The third way you can get involved is you can advertise on the channel. Now, I'd much rather the community of viewers would be advertisers on this channel than me going out to people who don't really know about SMWX and trying to explain it to them. So if you're a viewer and you have a business and you want to partner and you love this platform, let's partner on this channel. And then finally, you can buy merchandise, you can buy books. All this is in the description down below. Now let's get back to the episode. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The other key distinction and difference that I think we need to be mindful of between this period and the 94 period is that back then, Nelson Mandela was virtually sanctified. He was walking on water. He was renowned internationally. He was the most popular politician in South Africa by far, and that there probably will ever be. And he could do no wrong. He had the kind of political credibility that could sell a government of national unity, even to National Party supporters, right? Today, we have a weakened Cyril Ramaphosa, whose party doesn't command a majority, who's facing dark clouds of pala wrongdoing, who doesn't have the kind of moral credibility or political credibility to sustain the call for a government of national unity that can bring all kinds of players around the table. His political opponents are too relatively powerful for Ramaphosa to be able to say to the DA, I know you might not like it, but the EFF has to be at this table and MK has to be at this table, and to say to MK and the EFF the same thing. So whereas the government of national unity was largely, or in many ways, kept together by the persona of the towering figure of Mandela, we now may have a multi-party coalition masquerading as a government of national unity that is held together by a much weaker political figure in Cyril Ramaphosa, whose future and political future is far from certain the moment the government begins going. If indeed he is the president, which looks likely at this point, but one day is a long time in South African politics at this stage. Cool. So I don't think what is being proposed right now is a government of national unity. When I look at what seems to be happening as I move now to coalition dynamics, this is where I really think we are. The ANC, in typical fashion, was presented with a choice after the election, right? You either go with the DA with all its threats and opportunities, or you go with the EFF and or MK with all their threats and opportunities, right? And the ANC and Cyril Ramaphosa did what they always do. When presented with two options, two exclusive options, they tried to choose both and none at the same time. They couldn't make a choice, so they tried to do and appease all sides. Right? So they said, instead of us making this difficult choice, we're going to throw the ball back into the court of these opposition parties and say, well, everyone's welcome. We want to go into a coalition with everyone. We don't care who you are. Come into this government of national unity, right? And at that stage, it was an invitation to, and it could have been a true government of national unity. But then what happened? What happened was the two key opposition blocks, the DA bloc on the right and the EFF MK bloc on the left of the ANC, certainly on the left of the DA, actually said no. You are throwing the ball into our court. We're throwing it back into yours. You still have to make a choice, because the DA, it looks like, although it hasn't been fully confirmed, it looks like they don't want to go into any government of national unity if it includes the EFF and certainly MK. And the same applies. MK and the EFF have said, no, we're not going into a government of national unity if it has the DA. So where are we? We're actually back to square one. The ANC must make a choice. Now they're going to mask this choice by adding a group of smaller parties to the mix. So instead of an ANC-DA coalition, it's going to be ANC-DA, IFP, and maybe however many small parties they can convince to come along, right? And similarly, if they go the EFF-MK route, it'll be plus more small parties to try and muddy the waters, confuse those who aren't really focused, and say, this is a multi-party thing. It's not just, with the DA or with the EFF. It's with lots of different parties, right? But ultimately, now the choice is brought into focus. It's going to be a multi-party coalition with one key co-partner. Either the key co-partner will be the DA or the key co-partner will be the EFF and or MK. So that's what we face. We don't face a government of national unity. We face a multi-party coalition with the ANC plus one or two big opposition parties that excludes another opposition party. And why do I say that? Because if you exclude the EFF and the MK, you're excluding, 24% of the electorate, which is a massive slice, right? Means you only have 75% of the electorate in a GNU if everyone else is around the table. And the same with the DA. The DA has about 21%, so you're excluding 20% of the electorate, right? So it's not a government of national unity, it's a multi-party coalition that is leaning either towards one direction or another. Now, where do I think things are leaning? I think things are leaning towards the ANC DA option plus. ANC DA plus, let's call it, versus ANC EFF or MK plus. And I think the ANC is trying to find convenient ways to sell a partnership with the DA that doesn't look like an exclusive partnership with the DA. So that's where we are, and that's where I see things heading. It's heading in one of those two directions, and that's the direction where I think we're most likely to end up now. But again, things are fluid. So what are the potential opportunities and threats of ANC DA plus? Let me start with the opportunities. It seems interesting to me that the DA is quite aware that their policy offering is unpopular in the wider electorate, right? Even if they have 20% of the vote, that means 80% of people aren't big fans of their policy offering, right? So they've come out with a set of policy proposals which are actually quite linked to at least one faction, the more conservative faction of the ANC. And they've basically said, look, our preconditions for a coalition are kind of ANC policy. Maybe not exactly, but very similar, right? So what have the DA said? They said, we believe in the full and urgent implementation of Operation Vulindlela, which is an ANC economic policy being run out of the presidency, I believe. And then they say, these are the 7 priorities. The unbundling, read privatization of Eskom. The concessioning, read privatization of ports. The establishment of a water regulator. Again, in some ways taking the ability of the state to control water and riparian rights, they're called, slightly outside of the state. The implementation of a skills visa program, which I think most parties agree on. Title deed reform to expand land ownership. I have no idea what they mean by that. That could be a very retrogressive or a very progressive policy. But immediately when I look at that, I start to think, do they mean the formalization of land rights, particularly in rural areas? And then I start to think, traditional leadership is not going to be happy with that. And I start to think MK is wooing traditional leaders. So I start to see a big debate about land looming. But sorry, I'm still on the opportunities. Mineral rights reform, again, extremely vague. What do they mean by that? When you look at the DA's policy proposals, you're probably looking at a greater role for the private sector in mineral rights. Maybe some kind of rollback of the MPRDA, which is the key piece of legislation which ultimately vests mineral rights within the South African state. And then they say the rapid expansion of spectrum availability. I'm all for that, absolutely. Let's get information and data into the most hands possible at the cheapest rate. The ANC has been promising to do it for like 20 years, and they can't seem to do it. So what the DA has done here is quite pragmatic, as they've said, look, we're not going to make our most extreme proposals the foundation of this coalition. We're going to make those proposals which are closest to the ANC the foundation. Yes, there will be certain compromises towards DA policy, but we're not saying that we're going to be puritanical about our policies, right? Which I think is an interesting step and suggests that the DA is more prepared to compromise than many might have thought. So the opportunity here is that to the extent that conservative ANC policy can unlock economic growth and governance, doing so in partnership with the DA won't present a dramatic policy shift, which may also avoid some of the bigger splits within the ANC. Some of these things would also be good for the economy, like spectrum availability. It seems, however, that the DA is quite focused. It seems like out of their policy suite, they've seized the opportunity of privatization. They think that's the thing they can secure. They can speed up Eskom privatization. They can speed up port semi-privatization. And they're going to leave all the other stuff like labor market reform probably and affirmative action on the back burner. But if they can get privatization through the door, they feel like enough of their agenda has been honored. Now, what is the threat here? Well, I've already foreshadowed one, but it's part of a bigger threat, which I have spoken about before, so I won't over-elaborate. But I think what happens is that if you isolate MK and the EFF, and you make them the official opposition of the country, you're actually handing them a political gift, because this new government has exactly 100 days to show it can do something. After that, if it starts off stuttering and tottering and it can't get its act together, then it's going to be very difficult times, because the country is going to be impatient. The country is going to feel like there's been an anticlimax. And even people who aren't supporters of MK and EFF, if they play their cards right, will start to say, hey, you know, MK and EFF are not as extreme as I thought they were. They're actually making some interesting proposals. Yeah, they might be wrong on this and that, but you know, what they said about, you know, how the government is failing is resonating. So if I'm MK and EFF, I'm rubbing my hands at the possibility of being isolated and then being given the entire opposition terrain when all the other opposition parties are swallowed into this GNU potentially. I then become the contrast against this government. And if this government fails, then half my job is done, right? Because all I have to do is not even do anything major myself, right? Because remember, they won't be governing nationally, so they don't have to actually demonstrate any achievements. All they have to do is credibly criticize what the government is doing. So another threat for this multi-party coalition, ANC-DA-led, is this thing needs to get off the ground at hyper speed. 100 days may even be generous. This thing needs to show that it is working. And the sad thing is we have an incapable state. So the DA is taking a big gamble by saying they think that they can fix the state and get things moving. What if the state just is too broken for anything to happen in a year or 2 years? Well, we won't even get to that point because the whole thing will collapse before. So a big threat is that this government of national unity, it's all well and good to secure positions and stabilize the government and make markets chortle, right? But governing is going to be the hard part. And if this government doesn't demonstrate tangible results, which has been the failure of the Ramaphosa administration, right? They couldn't get any runs on the board to justify their position. If this government fails to do that, it's going to be toast. So that's where I see we are in terms of the coalition dynamics right now. I think there's maybe one more wrinkle we can explore, which is the provincial situation, right? Now, there are two provinces that need to be considered here, and that's KZN and Gauteng. I have this creative, I think, proposal for a government of national unity that won't happen because our leaders don't have the imagination for it. But if we were to have a true government of national unity, I would propose what I would call a multi-sphere government of national unity, right? So instead of just sharing power in the executive alone, I would share power across different spheres, so across the national, provincial, and local levels. So you could have something that looks a little like this, right? You have ANC, EFF, IFP nationally, right? So who gets left out of that? MK and the DA. So what do? You say to the DA, okay, in Gauteng, we're going to give you more power. So maybe you have an ANC-DA coalition in Gauteng, and you give the DA another metro back like Joburg in Gauteng. So the DA actually has quite a lot of control over Gauteng, right? So yes, they may have lost out nationally, but they've got stake in the future because they're now running Gauteng, right? And they're already running Tshwane, so they would also have Joburg and Tshwane, and they know that that's safe, so now they must work their so-called governance magic, right? I would do the same thing in KZN. I would say MK is left out nationally. So MK, you're the biggest party in KZN. You govern KZN maybe with the IFP over there, right? So there, the ANC and the DA aren't governing. They're in opposition. So what you see is you would then have quite a complex system in which power is shared, but it's not all concentrated in the executive, the sharing. It's actually shared across different spheres. And the reason why I think such a proposal would work, even though it's very unlikely to even get a hearing, is that what we need to do in this moment is make sure that every party, including very powerful minorities, actually have a stake in the future and don't just become incentivized to become spoilers, right? Because even very powerful minorities, whether they're 15% or 20 or 10, can spoil a majority of 85 or 90. Right? So that's the whole idea of a government of national unity. You bring in any party that feels excluded so that they don't have an incentive to spoil, right? So if you did that, then you would have a government of national unity, but you would have it spread across different places. Everyone would get something. No one would get everything or an unfair amount of power. Everyone would be invested in the future, but there would also be a competitive dynamic set up, right? Because MK would be set up against the DA in Gauteng and ANC. And then it would be like, okay, let's see who governs best, right? And in 2026, then voters can make their choice based on how much these parties have actually delivered to them. Now, there are lots of configurations of that. Maybe you could have ANC, DA plus nationally, but then you give the EFF more power in Gauteng. You say, hey, why don't you try to run a metro properly? Not like just be a small part of an MMC, collective, but actually run something. So there are lots of ways to skin this cat, but that's what I would try to do. Now, that would be an interesting government of national unity. But sadly, I don't think we have the imagination or probably the time to concoct something quite as elaborate and interconnected as that. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. So that's where we are with the coalition dynamics. I'll leave it there for now. Looking forward to your comments and your thoughts. Remember, on this channel, you don't have to agree or disagree. This is just a place where we try to deepen our respective understandings of what's happening. Oh, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, by the way. Cool. So as we close off this episode, finally, I want to come to the first sitting of Parliament, because this is proving to be one of the most important moments in South African political history, right? We have a Parliament where there's no winner for the first time. We have these coalition talks, and we have a narrowing window, a few days left for the sitting to actually happen. So what can you expect to happen, and what are the things to look out for? First thing I would look out for is, when does the Chief Justice, who's the person who gets to call the sitting, actually call it for? Is it going to be the Friday, the Monday? Is it going to be over the weekend? I don't even know if that's possible, but we need to know quite soon. And the Chief Justice is certainly taking his sweet time to tell us when this sitting is, right? The second thing I would look out for, of course, is this litigation which is happening, brought on the part of MK and various, I think it's 20 other political parties that are seeking to postpone this sitting. Funnily enough, I think the ANC wouldn't mind having the sitting postponed, because it's a difficult negotiation to bring to a conclusion in 5 days. What they're effectively arguing is two things. They want the sitting to be, this is MK and these other parties. I think they're going directly to the Constitutional Court, which can or may not hear this direct application. What they're saying is two things. Hold the sitting because, number one, we think that the IEC acted either irrationally or procedurally unfairly in the way that they declared the results and in the speed with which they declared the results. Alternatively, hold it because MK might not swear in their MPs, in which case, in their interpretation of Section 46, Parliament won't be constituted. Now, this is a fascinating debate, and I've already said publicly that I don't think the MK has a legal leg to stand on there, but things are getting more complicated the more I think about this question, right? So I just want to leave you with this thought, because I do think this Section 46 thing is a little more complicated than any side of the debate has actually considered. According to those who believe that MK not being sworn in will not affect the sitting, right? The first argument that's made is parliamentary quorum, that you don't need all those MPs there. Now, that's largely irrelevant because we're not talking about quorum, we're talking about constitution, right? We're talking about when does the National Assembly get constituted so that it actually can have a quorum. So it's not about quorum. We know what the quorum requirements are, and even the quorum requirements are a bit weird, which I'll get into, but we know what the quorum requirements are. The question is, quorum of what? Of a constituted National Assembly. So when does the National Assembly get constituted? Now, MK is advancing this view that only upon the swearing in of MPs does Parliament truly become constituted. So Section 46 of the Constitution says that the National Assembly, to be precise, because Parliament is two houses, the National Assembly consists of no fewer than 340 and no more than 400, right? So if the MK people don't come, then that means that there will be no 350, right? Because they have 58 seats. Now, some then argue, okay, if we put quorum aside for a second, that no, the National Assembly is constituted when you have a list and you have an election which tells you how many seats this list should be placed in. So list plus election equals constitution of the National Assembly, right? And that was the view that I thought was relatively persuasive before. However, you run into the following problem, right? So we are currently at the point now where the list has been handed over to the Chief Justice and we have an election. So according to this theory, Parliament has already been constituted, right? We already have 400 MPs. They are unable to perform their functions because they haven't been sworn in, but the House has been constituted, right? However, one complication here is that, is Cyril Ramaphosa then an MP? Because he's on the list has been handed to the Chief Justice, and Parliament has been constituted. All we need now is for parliamentarians to be sworn in, but that's all about the functions, not the constitution of Parliament. Here's the problem. If that's true, then we have a constitutional absurdity because you can't be president and a member of Parliament at the same time. So that is a bit of a complication for that theory that we already have a constituted National Assembly. And I guess the question that I would like those on the other side to then answer, because it's a complex legal debate and I don't have all the answers ready to hand, is what happens now with President Ramaphosa? And in which case, when is he not the president and when is he the president? And when does swearing in take place? It seems to me that he stops being the president when he's sworn in as a member of Parliament. But that means that it's swearing in that matters. So it's complicated, is what I can say. And probably we need some court to actually give us clarity on this question. So that's going to... Oh, by the way, we only have like 3 days to figure it out. So that's going to be a big question. There will be legal doubt over the first sitting. That's for sure. Or at least in the build-up to the first sitting. So watch what happens with MK. And then, of course, watch what happens with the vote. Who becomes speaker? Who becomes president? And I think it's interesting... And I'll end here. It's interesting that Speaker gets elected first. So what we may see is a different balance of power electing the Speaker and a different balance of power electing the President. And opposition parties still have a chance to elect a Speaker if they come together. Maybe they don't agree on the President, but they could agree on the Speaker. So it could be interesting. And I think it would be unfair for an ANC at 40% to have control of both the legislature and the executive. So one thing we know for sure, when all is said and done, is that the ANC is going to have to give up more power than it has ever given up before. That's what the voters said has to happen. Thanks for joining us on another installment of SMWX. Whether you're listening on a podcast or you're watching on YouTube, do all the things that help this platform grow. Give us a rating, give us a like, give us a share, give us a subscription. Tell your aunt, your grandfather, your grandmother, your uncle about this, or your son or your daughter. And let's keep spreading the fire, spreading the word. This channel grows by word of mouth, and it's amazing how you have helped it to grow by word of mouth. Let's keep it growing so that we can ensure that there is an independent digital channel which is not beholden to any of the mainstream interests, that can keep you updated and informed. Spread the fire. Thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you on many, many future episodes to come. Aye.